Hello and welcome to Writing Today. In this episode, I'll be doing a book review of Wuthering by Emily Bronte. If you enjoy this content, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to check out more of my content, you can find it all on thepennedsleuth.com, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. Without further ado, let's begin. Wuthering Hearts tells the tragic love story between two broken individuals, Catherine and Heathcliff, although it would be wrong for me to sum it up as simply as that, as it is a story that goes several steps further, talking about ghosts, madness, and evil deeds that bring two families to their knees. It is the first gothic fiction I have read that fits that niche genre. Here's my spoiler-free review of the classic novel Wuthering Hearts by Emily Bronte. First, let's start with a short summary. The character Mr. Lockwood, a gentleman, has rented a place called Thrushcross Grange, owned by Mr. Heathcliff. Upon arriving, he decides to see the owner, Heathcliff himself, at Wuthering Hearts, and after an eventful couple of visits, he is curious to learn more about the owner. Lockwood receives the whole tragic story from Ellen Dean, a servant at Thrushcross Grange, who is happy enough to tell him the story if it does not bore him. Thus, we learn the up and down but mostly down story of the two families, the Earnshaws and the Lintons, who lived in Wuthering Hearts and Thrushcross Grange, respectively. Always have difficulty saying Thrushcross Grange. It's quite a tongue twister. The story starts with the Earnshaw family, which consisted of the owner, Mr. Earnshaw, his children, Catherine and Hindley Earnshaw, Ellen Dean, who was the servant at the time, and finally the grumpy, bubble-punching servant named Joseph. Now for the characters. There is a range of characters to talk about, so I'll do my best to sum them up briefly in name and character without much else, because that would be giving the plot away. Lockwood, as I said earlier, is an outsider that comes to learn the story of Heathcliff and his acts towards the Earnshaws and the Lintons, through Ellen Dean, who serves at the home he has rented from Heathcliff in the present day. Ellen Dean is the narrator for most of the story, being a servant that was present for most of the major events of the story and relates it to Mr. Lockwood for his interest. It is from her first-person perspective most of the story is written. She can be summed up as the voice of reason throughout the book, as well as the storyteller. Next we have Heathcliff. Heathcliff is not like anyone in the middle-class families in the story, preferring his heavy-handed approach to things. He is quick to anger, and the events of the story give him plenty of reason to feel that way, especially events concerning his love Catherine. Speaking of which, we have Catherine herself, who is of a higher class than Heathcliff and comes to accept this as she grows up. Yet, that does not stop her from feeling something for Heathcliff, creating this pressure on the two's relationship, not to mention many other events. Next we have Catherine's brother, Hindley, who has a profound dislike of Heathcliff, and his mind is focused on this much until other tragedies consume it. Next we have Edgar Linton, who becomes a major character in the story a little later on. Edgar is one of the middle class from Thrushcross Grange. He is another figure of common sense, but this has its lapses throughout the events of the story. There are even more characters I can talk about beyond these few, but quite simply it gives too much away. I will say this though, for the sake of making the story less convoluted, that there are two characters named Catherine and one who is named Linton. The second Catherine will be commonly called Cathy, to not be confused with Catherine Earnshaw, who I've already talked about. As for Linton, that is his first name, not his last name, and he's referred to as Linton throughout. However, to avoid confusion, those who have the last name are referred to as Mr. or Mrs. Linton, or simply by their first names. It's a very small obstacle, so don't worry too much about it. Now for the writing style. If I was to speak plainly about the writing style, I would say to expect what should be expected from books written in English from the 19th century. meaning there will be descriptions that go on for a mile and monologues that go on for 2. Yet clarity is maintained throughout the book. You will understand what everyone means, what their intentions are, and their personalities, which really is the story itself. Perspective in this novel does shift from time to time, from Lockwood's perspective to Ellen Dean's perspective when telling the story, to Lockwood's retelling of the story from Ellen Dean's perspective. But it is highlighted enough so that there isn't much confusion, if any at all. Despite this, I took my time reading Wuthering Heights, as the last book I read was written in this decade, and I needed a moment to settle back into reading something much older than that. I've read a few classics, but there's always something about 18th and 19th century writing combined with dramatic stories that are a completely different ballgame from the adventures written in those times. With that said, you can read Wuthering Heights in 3 to 4 days comfortably, although if you take 1 or 2 more, I would perfectly understand, because I took 8 days to read this book. Now for my thoughts on Wuthering Heights. I chose to read Wuthering Heights for 2 real reasons. First, I know it is a classic, and it is mentioned occasionally in other media. Secondly, it is commonly read in school. Now, Wuthering Heights was never included in my school syllabus, of which I am thankful, because school often ruins classics for young readers. It is better to approach a classic willingly and read it as you normally would, without the pressure of knowing you will have to write a few thousand words about your thoughts, symbolism, and other garbage you read on the internet that might push your grade up. Even though I'm writing my thoughts about it now, I'm glad I read this book as an adult. I can see why this book was the kind of book to make it into the school syllabus, and at the same time I can see why my school, as did many others, took it out. The book is written well. I enjoyed the style and relating the story to my wife in my Guess What Heathcliff Did Now retellings. However, I realized that if this book had been written today, if it wasn't a classic that was thrown at students around the world and referenced in other media, I certainly wouldn't have read it. The plot, not so much the theme, doesn't suit my tastes, and I feel I enjoyed it for the wrong reasons. I'll probably have to repeat that statement again when I read Pride and Prejudice someday. Now to conclude. I feel that if I took up the mantle of a professional book reviewer, I would preach nothing but good things about Wuthering Heights and encourage all who haven't read it to drop what they are reading currently so they can read it immediately. However, I am not a professional book reviewer and am completely biased. If you enjoy tragic love stories with dark elements sprinkled here and there, then you will enjoy Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. If you want to read it because of its fame as a classic, I won't stop you, as I still took something from it in the end. However, if it doesn't sound like your cup of tea and it being a classic does little to sway you in reading it, then don't bother, you're not missing much. And that brings us to the end of this review. If you enjoy, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you want to see some of my work or further blog posts, you can find it all on my website, thepensleuth.com. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Thank you for listening, and as always, good day, good night, and happy reading.